The Valkyrie Empire had conquered 47 star systems in the past 3 centuries, and their massive fleet now hung in the darkness above Earth, like predators circling wounded prey. Admiral Drexar stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Dominion and watched the blue planet rotate slowly beneath him, while his tactical officers ran their standard invasion protocols. The scans came back within minutes, and the results made Drexar smile with the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing victory was already assured. Earth possessed no plasma cannons, and no antimatter warheads, and no graviton manipulators, and most importantly, no energy shields worth mentioning. The humans had some primitive rockets, and basic laser communications, and a few space stations that looked like they might fall apart in a strong solar wind. Drexar had seen this pattern dozens of times before, on dozens of worlds, and it always ended the same way with surrender and integration into the Empire. His second officer approached with a datapad and confirmed what the sensors already told them. The dominant species on Earth had barely begun to explore their own solar system with a few outposts on their moon and some mining operations on the red planet they called Mars. Their largest vessels were designed for cargo transport and scientific research, and nothing Drexar saw suggested they had any understanding of real military technology. The Valkyrie had faced species far more advanced than these humans, and crushed them with minimal effort. This would be another easy conquest, and another star system added to the Empire's growing territory. On Earth, the appearance of the alien fleet caused immediate panic across every nation and continent. Captain Jake Morrison was on leave at his family home in Colorado when the emergency broadcast interrupted every channel and every device simultaneously. Within 20 minutes he was racing toward Peterson Space Force Base, where his ship, the USS Defiance, waited in high orbit. The roads were chaos, with people fleeing cities and military convoys heading in every direction, but Jake kept his mind focused on what needed to be done. He had trained his entire adult life for deep space operations, but never imagined that training would be needed to defend Earth itself. The USS Defiance was humanity's newest deep space cruiser, and Jake had commanded her for 8 months on shakedown missions to the asteroid belt and back. His crew of 214 men and women were the best Earth had to offer, but they were designed to explore and survey, and maybe defend against pirates if humanity ever encountered any. They were not designed to fight an alien armada that could probably vaporize their ship with a single shot. Commander Ryan Hughes met Jake in the shuttle bay with a grim expression and a tablet full of bad news. The alien fleet numbered 23 capital ships, and each one was roughly 4 times the size of the Defiance. Earth's entire defensive fleet consisted of 12 ships, and most of them were older models with even less firepower than Jake's vessel. President Helen Carter convened an emergency session with military leadership in a bunker beneath the Pentagon. General Paul Bennett and Admiral Lisa Crawford were already present, along with dozens of other officers and civilian advisors. The room fell silent when the president entered, and everyone could see the weight of the situation in her eyes. She asked for options, and General Bennett explained that conventional military strategy suggested they had no options at all. The aliens had superior technology, and superior numbers, and superior positioning. Any fight would result in Earth's destruction within hours, if not minutes. Admiral Crawford suggested attempting communication and negotiation, but even she seemed to doubt that would accomplish anything meaningful. The alien ultimatum arrived exactly 3 hours after their fleet entered Earth's orbit. The message was translated automatically by their systems into every human language simultaneously, and broadcast on every frequency humanity used. Admiral Drexar's voice was cold and mechanical through the translation software. Earth had 48 hours to surrender unconditionally or face complete orbital bombardment of every major population center. Resistance would be met with total annihilation. Cooperation would result in integration into the Empire with minimal loss of life. The terms were non-negotiable, and the deadline was absolute. Jake Morrison listened to the ultimatum from the bridge of the Defiance, while his crew worked frantically around him. Lieutenant Amy Walsh, his chief engineer, was rerouting power systems to maximize their defensive capabilities, which honestly would not matter much against weapons that could crack a planet. Lieutenant Chris Parker, his tactical officer, was running combat simulations, and each one ended with humanity's fleet destroyed in the opening minutes of engagement. Commander Hughes stood beside Jake and spoke quietly about their families and what surrender would mean for everyone they loved. Neither man had an answer that felt acceptable. In the research facilities beneath Geneva, Dr. Nathan Pierce was having a very different conversation with his team of scientists and engineers. Pierce had spent 15 years developing Earth's magnetic acceleration technology, and his railgun prototypes could fire projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. His colleague, Dr. Claire Stevens, specialized in theoretical physics, and she was looking at the Valkyrie sensor data that had been intercepted and decoded by intelligence services. Something about the alien scans bothered her, and she kept running the numbers over and over while Pierce and the others debated possible responses. Finally, she stood up and announced something that made everyone in the room stop talking. The Valkyrie scanners had performed detailed analysis of Earth's energy signatures and electromagnetic frequencies and nuclear capabilities, but they had not scanned for kinetic weapons at all. The alien sensors were not designed to detect primitive ballistic technology, because no advanced civilization used such ancient methods anymore. Pierce understood immediately what Stevens was suggesting, and he brought up the specifications for every weapon system in Earth's arsenal. The railguns and coil guns, and good old-fashioned explosive missiles that humanity had perfected over centuries of warfare. None of these systems used exotic energy or alien technology, and all of them relied on simple physics that had been understood since Newton. Mass times velocity equals force, and if you could get enough mass moving fast enough, it did not matter what kind of shields protected the target. Pierce grabbed his phone and called General Bennett directly, while Stevens began calculating optimal firing solutions. If the aliens could not detect their weapons, then maybe, just maybe, humanity had one advantage that could make a difference. Admiral Drexar retired to his quarters, confident that the humans would surrender long before the deadline expired. They always did. Once they understood the futility of resistance. He had conquered 12 worlds personally during his career, and witnessed the conquest of 20 more. The pattern never changed, and he saw no reason why Earth would be any different. His crew could handle the monitoring, and he needed rest before the inevitable surrender negotiations began. As he drifted to sleep, he thought briefly about the human vessels gathered near their moon, but dismissed them as irrelevant. Ships that small, with technology that primitive, could do nothing against the might of the Empire. Tomorrow would bring another easy victory and another medal for his collection. He had no idea how wrong he was about everything. The first 24 hours of the deadline passed in a blur of emergency meetings and desperate planning sessions. President Carter barely slept, and neither did anyone else in the command structure as they wrestled with a problem that seemed to have no solution. General Bennett wanted to evacuate as many people as possible from major cities, but Admiral Crawford pointed out that there was nowhere to evacuate to if the aliens decided to sterilize the entire planet. The mood in every government facility was grim, and resignation seemed to settle over the military leadership like a heavy fog. Then Dr. Nathan Pierce arrived at the Pentagon with Dr. Claire Stevens and a presentation that changed everything. Pierce was escorted into the main briefing room, where President Carter and her entire military staff had assembled. He looked exhausted, and his clothes were rumpled from working through the night, but his eyes were bright with something that might have been hope or might have been madness. He connected his laptop to the main display and brought up sensor data from the Valkyrie scans, along with technical specifications for every weapons system Earth currently deployed. General Bennett started to protest that they had already reviewed Earth's capabilities and found them wanting, but Pierce held up his hand and asked for just 5 minutes. What he explained in those 5 minutes made everyone in the room reconsider everything they thought they knew about the situation. The Valkyrie Empire, like every other spacefaring civilization in the galaxy, had evolved along a specific technological path. They developed energy shields to protect against cosmic radiation and solar flares during early space exploration. Then they developed energy weapons to overcome those same shields when they encountered other species. This cycle had repeated across the galaxy for millions of years until every advanced race used some variation of the same basic technology. Energy attacks met energy defenses, and warfare became a contest of who had more powerful generators and more efficient field emitters. But humanity had never followed that path, because humans had never encountered aliens before and never needed to develop shields against energy weapons. Instead, Earth had perfected kinetic weapons to a degree that no other species had bothered with for thousands of years. Dr. Stevens pulled up combat footage from historical Earth conflicts, and showed what modern railguns could do to armored targets. A tungsten rod weighing a few kilograms and accelerated to even a fraction of light speed carried more kinetic energy than a nuclear warhead. The physics were undeniable, and the math was simple. The Valkyrie shields were designed to refract and disperse energy, but they would do absolutely nothing against solid projectiles, because that was not what they were built to stop. It would be like bringing a fire extinguisher to stop a flood or wearing sunglasses to block a punch. The aliens had scanned Earth, looking for energy signatures and exotic particles, and found none, so they concluded humans had no weapons worth worrying about. Admiral Crawford leaned forward and asked the obvious question. If this was true, then why had no other species in the galaxy used kinetic weapons to defeat the Valkyrie before? Stevens explained that most species abandoned ballistic technology early in their development once they discovered energy manipulation. Kinetic weapons were considered primitive and inefficient compared to plasma cannons and particle beams. Any race advanced enough to threaten the Valkyrie had long since moved past projectile weapons, and therefore the Empire had never needed to defend against them. Humanity was unique not because they were more advanced but because they were less advanced in exactly the right way. Jake Morrison received Pierce's data package, while the Defiance orbited Earth's moon alongside the rest of humanity's fleet. He called his senior officers to the bridge and walked them through the analysis, while Lieutenant Chris Parker ran simulations on the tactical computer. The results were stunning and almost impossible to believe. According to the models, their magnetic accelerator cannons would punch straight through Valkyrie shields without even slowing down. Their missile pods loaded with conventional explosives would detonate against alien hulls because the shields would not register them as threats. Even their basic coil guns designed for asteroid mining could potentially damage enemy vessels if they got close enough. Commander Ryan Hughes was skeptical and voiced concerns that the simulations might be wrong or incomplete. They were gambling everything on theoretical analysis and assumptions about alien technology they barely understood. If Pierce and Stevens were mistaken, then humanity's fleet would be destroyed in the opening seconds of combat and Earth would be defenseless. But Lieutenant Amy Walsh pointed out that they were already defenseless, according to conventional analysis. If they surrendered, the best outcome was slavery, and the worst was extinction. At least Pierce's plan gave them a fighting chance, even if it was a slim one. Jake requested and received permission to address the entire fleet. 12 ships and over 2,000 crew members listened as he explained their new strategy. The alien sensors could not detect their weapons, which meant surprise was on their side. The Valkyrie shields could not stop their weapons, which meant they had a tactical advantage despite being outgunned and outnumbered. But success depended on complete coordination and perfect execution because they would only get one chance. If they failed, then at least they would fail fighting for their world and their species. The speech was not eloquent or inspiring, but it was honest, and that was what his people needed to hear. Captain Greg Turner commanded the USS Valiant, and he was the first to confirm his ship was ready for combat. Captain Beth Armstrong on the USS Resolute was right behind him with a message that her crew was prepared to do whatever was necessary. One by one, the other captains checked in until all 12 ships had committed to the plan. They began repositioning slowly and carefully to avoid alerting the Valkyrie to their intentions. Jake wanted them spread out enough to hit multiple targets simultaneously, but close enough to support each other if the aliens adapted faster than expected. On the Valkyrie flagship, Admiral Drexar was growing impatient with the humans and their silence. The deadline was approaching, and Earth's government had not responded to the ultimatum with either surrender or defiance. His tactical officer reported that human military vessels were moving into new positions, but their formation made no strategic sense. They were too dispersed to concentrate fire, and too close to be attempting an escape vector. Drexar interpreted this as confusion and panic rather than preparation for combat. He ordered his fleet to begin charging their main weapons and moving into bombardment formation. If the humans would not respond, then he would make the decision for them. President Carter made one final address to the people of Earth with 6 hours remaining until the deadline. She explained that humanity would not surrender and would not bow to threats from invaders who demanded submission. Earth's fleet was preparing to defend their world, and every person on the planet should be proud of the courage their military was showing. She did not mention the kinetic weapons strategy or the hope that Pierce's analysis was correct because if it failed, she wanted people to remember their defenders as heroes, not as desperate fools. She finished her speech and closed the connection, and then sat in silence with General Bennett and Admiral Crawford, and waited to see if humanity would survive the next day. Jake Morrison checked and rechecked every system on the Defiance, while his crew performed final preparations. Lieutenant Walsh had pushed their reactors to maximum safe output and rerouted every spare joule of power to the railgun capacitors. Lieutenant Parker had programmed firing solutions for 3 different Valkyrie ships with contingencies if targets changed or moved. Commander Hughes had personally inspected every weapons mount and confirmed they were loaded and ready. Everything that could be done had been done. And now, they could only wait for the battle to begin. Jake thought about his family and his home and everything he was fighting to protect, and then he cleared his mind and focused on the job ahead. In a few hours they would learn if human ingenuity was enough to overcome alien superiority, or if this would be humanity's final stand against an uncaring universe. The deadline expired at exactly 0800 hours Greenwich Mean Time, and Admiral Drexar wasted no time in demonstrating the consequences of human defiance. His fleet moved into attack formation with the precision of a military force that had performed this maneuver countless times on countless worlds. The Eternal Dominion took point position while 6 heavy cruisers spread out in a crescent formation, designed to maximize firing arcs against planetary targets. 16 smaller destroyers formed a defensive screen around the capital ships, and their energy shields blazed to full power, creating a barrier that could withstand nuclear weapons and small asteroid impacts. The display of force was meant to be overwhelming and terrifying, and it succeeded on both counts for anyone watching from Earth's surface. Jake Morrison watched the alien fleet deploy and felt his stomach tighten with fear that he could not afford to show his crew. The Valkyrie ships were beautiful in a terrible way, with sleek hulls and glowing energy fields that made them look more like living creatures than machines. The Defiance and her sister ships looked crude and blocky by comparison, like ancient ironclads facing off against modern warships. But crude and blocky meant solid and reliable, and right now Jake needed reliable more than he needed pretty. He opened a channel to the fleet and gave the order to begin their approach. At 1/4 thrust. They needed to get closer before opening fire, but not so fast that the aliens perceived them as an immediate threat. Admiral Drexar observed the human vessels beginning their approach, and found it almost sad that they thought they could accomplish anything. His tactical officer reported that the enemy ships were accelerating slowly toward the Valkyrie fleet, in what appeared to be a standard attack formation. The humans had placed their largest vessels at the front, which made sense from a primitive tactical perspective, but would accomplish nothing against superior firepower. Drexar considered simply ignoring them and beginning the bombardment of Earth, but decided that destroying the human fleet first would serve as a better demonstration of power. He gave the order to open fire, and his weapons officer complied immediately with obvious enthusiasm. The first energy beams lanced out from the Valkyrie cruisers like spears of pure light. They crossed the distance between the fleets in seconds and slammed into the leading human vessels with enough power to vaporize a small moon. The USS Frontier, commanded by Commander Dan Cooper, took a direct hit to her bow, and her basic shields flared and collapsed under the assault. Emergency alarms screamed across her bridge as hull plating melted and atmosphere vented from 3 compartments. Cooper ordered damage control teams to the affected areas and rerouted power from non-essential systems, but he knew his ship could not take many more hits like that. 2 more energy beams struck the Defiance, and Jake felt the impacts through the deck plating as their shields struggled to dissipate the thermal energy. Lieutenant Amy Walsh reported that their shields were down to 60% capacity and falling with each hit. They had maybe 2 more direct strikes before the shields failed completely, and then they would be relying on armor plating alone. Lieutenant Chris Parker noted that the aliens were firing in a pattern designed to test their defenses and probe for weak points, which meant heavier attacks were coming. Commander Ryan Hughes suggested they return fire immediately before more ships were disabled. But Jake held his hand steady and kept the fleet advancing. They needed to be closer, and they needed the aliens to be absolutely confident in their superiority. Every second they delayed was another second for doubt to creep into his mind. but he trusted the math and the science and the brilliant people who had promised him this would work. The Valkyrie launched a second volley, and this time, they concentrated fire on 3 targets simultaneously. The USS Guardian under Captain Sophie Blake took multiple hits, and her shields collapsed entirely, leaving her hull exposed to vacuum and energy weapons. Blake ordered her crew to abandon the forward sections and retreat to reinforced compartments, while she kept her ship in formation. The USS Resolute and USS Valiant both suffered damage but remained combat effective as their crews worked frantically to maintain systems under fire. Jake watched his fleet take punishment and forced himself not to flinch because his people needed him steady and calm, even if he felt neither of those things. Admiral Drexar smiled as human ships began showing signs of damage and distress. Their shields were failing, and their formations were becoming ragged, and within minutes, his fleet would finish them off completely. His tactical officer reported that the human vessels were still advancing, which made no sense unless they were planning to ram his ships in some kind of desperate suicide attack. Drexar found that almost admirable in a foolish way, and made a note to mention the humans' courage in his after-action report. They were primitive and doomed, but at least they died fighting rather than begging for mercy. Jake checked the range indicators and saw they had reached optimal firing distance, according to Parker's calculations. Any closer, and the aliens might suspect something was wrong, but any further and their kinetic weapons would lose too much accuracy. He opened the fleet channel and spoke 3 words that would either save humanity or doom them all. He said fire everything now and then, held his breath while the fate of Earth hung in the balance. The human fleet unleashed hell in a form the galaxy had not seen in millennia. Magnetic accelerator cannons spun up to full power and hurled tungsten penetrators at velocities that bent space-time around their trajectories. Coil guns fired streams of depleted uranium slugs in such quantity that they looked like solid beams connecting the human ships to their alien targets. Missile pods opened and released hundreds of conventional explosive warheads on ballistic trajectories that required no guidance systems or fancy technology. Everything humanity had built to kill other humans was now directed at the Valkyrie, with the full weight of a species fighting for survival. The results were immediate and catastrophic for the alien fleet. The Valkyrie shields did exactly what they were designed to do, which was absolutely nothing against kinetic weapons. Tungsten rods passed through the energy barriers like they were not even there, and struck the Eternal Dominion's hull with enough force to create small fusion reactions on impact. Each penetrator punched clean through the outer armor and kept going through multiple internal decks before finally stopping deep inside the ship. Explosions rippled along the flagship's flank as atmosphere ignited and fuel lines ruptured, and systems that were never meant to be exposed to weapons fire simply disintegrated. Admiral Drexar grabbed his command chair as the Eternal Dominion lurched under impacts that should not have been possible. His damage control screens lit up with red indicators, showing hull breaches on 17 different decks. His shield officer reported full power to all defensive fields, but somehow the human weapons were bypassing them completely. Drexar demanded an explanation, and his science officer pulled up sensor data with shaking hands. The readings showed no energy signatures, and no exotic particles, and no antimatter reactions. The humans were shooting them with simple metal projectiles moving very fast, and the sensors had not even classified them as weapons because they were too primitive to register as threats. The human fleet pressed their advantage while the aliens were still processing what had happened. Captain Beth Armstrong coordinated a missile strike with Captain Greg Turner, and their combined barrage of 300 conventional warheads slammed into a Valkyrie cruiser that was too busy analyzing the impossible data to take evasive action. The explosions walked along the alien vessel's spine, breaking it into 3 pieces that tumbled away, trailing debris and frozen atmosphere. Captain Sophie Blake managed to get the Guardian's railguns back online, despite the damage, and put a tungsten rod straight through a destroyer's reactor housing. The enemy ship vanished in a flash of light that left after images on human sensors for several seconds. Jake Morrison saw the Valkyrie fleet beginning to break formation and knew this was their moment. He ordered all ships to focus fire on the Eternal Dominion because killing the flagship would destroy the enemy's command and control. 12 human vessels turned their guns on the massive alien dreadnought and fired as fast as their weapons could cycle. The Dominion's hull came apart under the sustained bombardment, like wet paper in a hailstorm. Admiral Drexar tried to order evasive maneuvers, but his helm was not responding, and his engineering deck was not responding, and half his ship was not responding because they were all dead or dying. His last coherent thought was that he had been defeated by primitives, using weapons his people had abandoned before humans had even discovered fire, and the sheer impossibility of it offended him more than the death approaching rapidly. The Eternal Dominion died in fire and fury that lit up Earth's night sky like a second sun. Her reactor containment failed first, and the resulting explosion ripped through the massive vessel from stern to bow. Secondary explosions followed as fuel tanks and ammunition stores and power conduits all added their energy to the conflagration. The shockwave from the flagship's destruction caught two nearby destroyers and crumpled their hulls like aluminum cans before sending them spinning into the void. Human crews watched in stunned silence as the largest ship in the Velkari fleet simply ceased to exist over the course of 3 terrible seconds. Lieutenant Amy Walsh was the first to break the silence on the Defiance's bridge. She reported that their railguns were overheating from sustained fire and needed at least 2 minutes to cool before they could safely fire again. Lieutenant Chris Parker followed up with damage assessments, showing that 6 of their missile pods were empty and the remaining 4 were down to less than half capacity. Commander Ryan Hughes added that their shields had failed completely about 30 seconds before the enemy flagship exploded, which meant they had been fighting naked and exposed without even realizing it. Jake Morrison processed all this information and then ordered the fleet to maintain firing positions because the battle was not over yet. The remaining Velkari vessels were in complete disarray without their command ship and their admiral. Individual captains tried to take charge, but none of them had the authority or experience to coordinate a fleet action. Some ships attempted to move into defensive formations, while others began charging their weapons for another attack. A few of the smaller destroyers simply stopped moving entirely, as if their crews were too shocked to function. The unified threat that had terrified Earth just minutes earlier had become a collection of confused and frightened aliens who suddenly realized they might not survive the encounter. On Earth, General Paul Bennett coordinated the ground-based railgun installations that Dr. Nathan Pierce had spent the last 2 days preparing. These weapons were originally designed to shoot down asteroids and space debris, but Pierce had modified their targeting systems to track Velkari vessels. The installations were scattered across 6 continents, and their combined firepower rivaled what the orbital fleet could deliver. Bennett gave the firing order and watched as 23 railguns launched their projectiles into space on carefully calculated trajectories. The weapons fired from the ground had to account for atmospheric drag and planetary rotation, but Pierce's calculations were precise and the results spoke for themselves. Tungsten penetrators launched from Earth's surface screamed through the atmosphere, trailing plasma, and struck 3 Velkari cruisers that were attempting to regroup. The ground-based weapons hit with even more force than the orbital railguns, because they had gravity assisting their acceleration. One cruiser took a rod straight through its command deck, and the entire front third of the ship simply disintegrated. Another was hit in its main engine assembly, and began tumbling out of control as its power systems cascaded into failure. The third managed to survive the initial impact, but secondary explosions tore through its interior and left it dead in space. Captain Greg Turner, on the USS Valiant, identified a cluster of 4 destroyers, trying to form a protective screen around one of the remaining heavy cruisers. He contacted Captain Beth Armstrong on the Resolute, and they coordinated a pincer attack designed to split the enemy formation. The Valiant came in high while the Resolute swept low, and both ships fired their coil guns in sustained bursts that filled space with depleted uranium slugs. The Velkari destroyers tried to maneuver, but they were designed to fight enemies using energy weapons with predictable firing patterns. Kinetic weapons moved in straight lines at constant velocities, and there was no dodging physics. 2 destroyers were shredded by the crossfire, and the other 2 broke formation to escape. Jake Morrison identified a critical vulnerability in one of the Velkari cruisers that was trying to move away from the battle. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Parker, noted that the ship's reactor housing was exposed where previous damage had torn away hull plating. It was a small target and a difficult shot, but if they could hit it, the resulting explosion would take the entire vessel. Jake ordered all remaining ships with functioning railguns to target that specific point and fire in sequence. The USS Defiance went first, followed by the USS Resolute, and then the USS Valiant, and finally 3 smaller vessels whose names would be remembered in human history. 7 tungsten rods converged on a target no larger than a commercial aircraft, and 6 of them hit within a 2-meter radius. The Valkyrie cruiser's reactor shielding failed catastrophically, and the containment field collapsed in on itself before rebounding outward. The explosion was smaller than the Eternal Dominion's death, but no less final. The cruiser folded in half like a book closing, and then came apart in a cloud of debris and vaporized metal. Commander Ryan Hughes reported confirmed kill, and Jake allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before returning his attention to the battle. They had destroyed 9 Valkyrie vessels and damaged at least 6 more, but there were still 8 ships in fighting condition, and any one of them could destroy Earth if given the opportunity. The surviving Valkyrie captains finally achieved something resembling coordination and began a fighting retreat away from Earth. They were no longer trying to conquer or intimidate, but simply to escape with their lives and their ships. Captain Sophie Blake, on the badly damaged USS Guardian, moved to intercept 2 destroyers that were trying to flank around the human formation. Her shields were gone, and her hull was breached in multiple locations, but her weapons still functioned and her crew still fought. She put railgun rounds into both destroyers and forced them to break off their attack run, even though it meant exposing her ship to return fire. One of the Valkyrie destroyers managed to get a clean shot at the Guardian and took it without hesitation. The energy beam cut through the human vessel's weakened hull like a knife through butter, and her reactor went critical before her crew could initiate emergency shutdown. Captain Blake had 3 seconds to realize what was happening, and no time to do anything about it. The Guardian exploded with enough force to damage both the destroyers that killed her, and her sacrifice bought the rest of the fleet time to reposition. Jake Morrison made a note to recommend Blake and her crew for the highest honors Earth could bestow, assuming any of them survived to give out medals. Admiral Lisa Crawford had taken command of the USS Vengeance when her original ship was disabled in the opening moments of the battle. She led a pursuit of 3 Valkyrie cruisers that were attempting to reach jump distance where they could escape to faster-than-light travel. Crawford pushed her engines past safe limits and gained ground while her weapons officer fired everything that would shoot. One of the fleeing cruisers took a missile to its engine cluster and dropped out of the race, tumbling end over end. The other 2 kept running, but Crawford stayed on them like a hunting dog that had tasted blood. On the surface of Earth, billions of people watched the battle unfold through telescopes and sensors and broadcast feeds. They saw their ships fighting impossible odds and winning through courage and cleverness and weapons that the enemy had never expected. They saw the Guardian die defending her sisters, and they saw the Valkyrie fleet broken and scattered by vessels a fraction of their size. President Helen Carter watched from her bunker and allowed herself to hope for the first time since the aliens arrived. General Bennett and Dr. Pierce stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the battle itself was not already saying louder. The Valkyrie attempted one final coordinated attack using their 5 remaining functional warships. They concentrated their fire on the Defiance in an attempt to kill the ship that seemed to be leading the human resistance. Jake Morrison saw the energy beams coming and knew his vessel could not survive that much firepower. He ordered emergency maneuvers and his helmsman did her best, but space combat was not like the movies, and ships did not turn on a dime. The Defiance took 3 direct hits to her starboard side, and her entire right flank became a twisted ruin of metal and ceramics. Lieutenant Walsh reported multiple reactor warnings and hull breaches on 8 decks and casualties in the dozens. Jake stayed in his chair and ordered return fire because if they were going to die, then they would take enemies with them. But they did not die because the USS Valiant and USS Resolute moved to intercept and drew fire away from the Defiance. Captain Turner and Captain Armstrong coordinated their defense, and their combined firepower forced the Valkyrie to break off their attack. 2 more alien ships died in the exchange, and the remaining 3 finally accepted that they could not win this fight. The surviving Valkyrie vessels broadcast surrender signals on every frequency and shut down their weapons in the universal sign of yielding. The Battle of Earth was over, and humanity had won against every expectation and every reasonable prediction. The cost had been terrible, and the losses would be mourned, but Earth was still free, and the alien invaders had learned that humans were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. The silence after the battle was almost as overwhelming as the noise during it. Jake Morrison sat in his damaged command chair on the ruined bridge of the Defiance and tried to process what had just happened. Around him, his crew worked frantically to contain fires and seal breaches and care for the wounded. The ship groaned and creaked like a living thing in pain, and somewhere in the distance, alarms still wailed, despite multiple attempts to silence them. Commander Ryan Hughes approached with a datapad showing casualty reports, and Jake forced himself to read the numbers, even though each one felt like a knife in his chest. 43 dead on the Defiance alone, and over 200 wounded. Across the fleet, the losses were worse, with the Guardian completely destroyed and 3 other vessels so badly damaged they would never fly again. But Earth was safe. That was the thought Jake kept coming back to as he reviewed the damage reports and the casualty lists. Earth was safe, and humanity was free, and the alien invaders had been beaten so badly that the survivors were begging for mercy. 3 Valkyrie warships hung in space, broadcasting surrender on every frequency while their crews waited to learn their fate. Jake opened a channel to what remained of Earth's defensive fleet and asked for recommendations on how to proceed. Captain Greg Turner suggested destroying the surrendered vessels immediately before they could recover and counterattack. Captain Beth Armstrong argued for accepting their surrender and taking prisoners who could provide intelligence on the Empire and its weaknesses. Admiral Lisa Crawford pointed out that how humanity treated defeated enemies would set the tone for all future encounters with alien species. President Helen Carter made the final decision from her bunker beneath the Pentagon. She ordered Jake Morrison to accept the Valkyrie surrender and take their ships and crews into custody. Earth would treat prisoners according to international law and Geneva Conventions, even if those documents had been written for human conflicts. The message this sent to the galaxy was important because other species would be watching and judging humanity based on their actions. Carter wanted the universe to know that humans were fierce when threatened but merciful when victorious. General Paul Bennett transmitted orders for orbital platforms to track the surrendered vessels and authorized use of force if they showed any signs of hostility. The Valkyrie captains were informed that any attempt to flee or fight would result in immediate destruction, and they complied without hesitation. Dr. Nathan Pierce and Dr. Claire Stevens watched the aftermath from their facility in Geneva and allowed themselves a moment of triumph. Their analysis had been correct, and their calculations had worked, and their faith in human ingenuity had been justified. Pierce pulled up sensor logs from the battle and began studying them with the intensity of a man who had just discovered a new fundamental law of physics. The data showed exactly how kinetic weapons interacted with energy shields and confirmed theories that had been purely academic just days earlier. Stevens was already writing reports that would revolutionize human understanding of defensive technology and military strategy. They had proven that sometimes the old ways were better than the new ways, and that advancement was not always about moving forward. The Valkyrie prisoners were transported to secure facilities on the Moon, where they could be held safely away from Earth's population. The interrogations began immediately with linguists and xenobiologists working alongside military intelligence to understand their captives. What they learned painted a picture of a galaxy far larger and more complex than humanity had imagined. The Valkyrie Empire controlled 47 star systems, but they were far from the most powerful faction among the stars. There were older civilizations, and stronger fleets, and conflicts that had raged for millennia. The Empire had grown comfortable in their dominance of nearby space, and had become arrogant in their assessment of potential threats. Earth's victory would send shockwaves through the galactic community and change how every species viewed humanity. One of the captured Valkyrie officers was a captain named in their records who had survived the destruction of his destroyer. Through translators, he explained that the Empire had never encountered a species like humanity. Most races followed predictable patterns of technological development and could be categorized and countered using standard military doctrine. Humans were unique because they had developed advanced space travel and sophisticated computers while still relying on primitive weapons that dated back thousands of years. This combination of old and new was something the Valkyrie had no framework to understand or defend against. The officer predicted that news of their defeat would cause panic among the Empire's leadership and possibly inspire other conquered species to rebel. President Carter addressed the world 3 days after the battle, when the full scope of victory became clear. She spoke about the brave men and women who had given their lives defending Earth and promised that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. She announced plans to build a memorial on the moon visible from Earth, where the names of every casualty would be inscribed in stone brought from all 7 continents. She also revealed that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that Earth must now decide how to engage with a galactic community that had just learned humans were far more dangerous than they appeared. The speech was broadcast on every channel and translated into every language, and people around the world began to understand that everything had changed forever. Jake Morrison was promoted to admiral and given command of Earth's expanded military space program. His first task was overseeing construction of a new fleet using lessons learned from the battle and technology salvaged from captured Valkyrie vessels. Human engineers studied alien ships and found ways to integrate their power systems with Earth's kinetic weapons. The result was a hybrid design that combined the best of both civilizations. Ships with energy shields to protect against attacks from other species, but with railguns and missiles to strike back with weapons nobody expected. Admiral Morrison personally approved the designs and made sure every new vessel was named after ships or crew members lost in the Battle of Earth. Commander Ryan Hughes took command of the Defiance after 6 months of repairs restored her to combat capability. Lieutenant Amy Walsh was promoted to chief engineer for the entire fleet and given resources to develop the next generation of magnetic accelerator technology. Lieutenant Chris Parker became head of tactical training and responsible for teaching new officers how to fight, using the unconventional strategies that had saved Earth. Captain Greg Turner and Captain Beth Armstrong were both given their own squadrons and tasked with patrolling the outer solar system against future threats. The heroes of Earth's defense became the foundation of humanity's military expansion into the stars. Dr. Nathan Pierce received funding for a research installation on Mars, dedicated to weapons development and defensive systems. Dr. Claire Stevens joined him as co-director, and together, they pushed the boundaries of what human technology could achieve. They studied captured Valkyrie equipment and reverse-engineered principles that Earth scientists had never considered. But they never forgot the lesson that the Battle of Earth had taught them, which was that sometimes simple solutions were better than complex ones. The research station became known throughout the solar system as the place where human creativity met alien technology and produced results that neither could achieve alone. Admiral Lisa Crawford was appointed as Earth's first official ambassador to the galactic community. She traveled aboard a specially built diplomatic vessel to make contact with other species and establish relationships with civilizations that had existed for millions of years. Crawford carried with her complete records of the Battle of Earth and instructions to share them freely with anyone interested. President Carter wanted the galaxy to know exactly how humanity had defeated the Valkyrie and to understand that Earth would defend itself against any aggressor using whatever methods proved effective. Crawford's mission was to seek peace and cooperation, but to make absolutely clear that humanity was not prey and would not be conquered. The Valkyrie Empire collapsed within a year of their defeat at Earth. News of their flagship's destruction and their fleet's surrender spread through their conquered territories like wildfire. Species that had been subjugated for centuries rose up in rebellion, and the Empire lacked the military strength to suppress them all. Some Valkyrie worlds sued for peace and offered reparations to their former slaves. Others fought to maintain control and were destroyed by coalitions of freed species. The galactic balance of power shifted dramatically, and older civilizations took note of the newcomers who had triggered such massive change. 2 years after the battle, a delegation from an ancient federation arrived at Earth seeking an alliance. They represented species that had been spacefaring since before humans had learned to write, and they came offering technology and knowledge in exchange for access to human military expertise. President Carter negotiated carefully and agreed to limited cooperation while maintaining Earth's independence. The Federation was particularly interested in kinetic weapons and asked permission to study human designs. Carter agreed on the condition that Earth received equal access to Federation technology and that all agreements respected human autonomy. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of humanity's first true battleship and looked out at the fleet under his command. 20 vessels of various classes, all built in orbital shipyards around Earth and Mars. Each ship carried railguns and missiles alongside plasma cannons and particle beams. Each crew was trained in the hybrid tactics that combined human ingenuity with alien sophistication. The fleet was preparing for its first long-range expedition beyond the solar system, to explore neighboring stars and establish human presence in the wider galaxy. Morrison thought about Admiral Drexar and the Valkyrie who had come to Earth, expecting easy conquest. He wondered what the late Admiral would think, seeing humanity's fleet, now armed with weapons from a dozen different civilizations and tactics that no military academy in the galaxy taught. The Battle of Earth became legend among spacefaring species. Stories spread of the primitives who defeated an empire using weapons so old that modern sensors did not recognize them as threats. Some species laughed at the Valkyrie's stupidity and hubris. Others saw the lesson and began reconsidering their own military doctrines and technological assumptions. A few civilizations reached out to Earth, seeking to learn from humanity's example and understand how thinking differently could provide advantages. President Carter welcomed these contacts and authorized cultural and scientific exchanges while maintaining strict security around military installations and research facilities. Earth's population grew to understand their place in a galaxy full of ancient civilizations and complex politics. Schools began teaching xenobiology and galactic history alongside traditional subjects. Children grew up knowing that humanity was neither alone nor helpless, and that their species had earned respect through courage and creativity. The generation born after the battle would become the first true citizens of galactic society, carrying human values and perspective to worlds beyond imagination. Jake Morrison retired from active duty after 10 years of service and returned to Earth, where he wrote a book about the Battle of Earth and the lessons humanity learned. The book became required reading at every military academy in human space and was translated into 40 different alien languages. Morrison spent his remaining years teaching at the Colorado Military Institute, where he trained officers for the expanding fleet. He never forgot the friends he lost or the fear he felt when facing impossible odds. But he also never regretted the choices he made or the path humanity took after that first terrible contact with an alien empire. The galaxy learned that humans were dangerous not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they refused to accept limitations others took for granted. When every other species abandoned kinetic weapons, humanity perfected them. When conventional wisdom said surrender was the only option, humanity fought anyway. When the established order said newcomers should know their place, humanity demanded respect and earned it through blood and determination. Earth's victory over the Valkyrie Empire became a turning point in galactic history, and the moment when humanity announced to the universe that they would never bow and never break and never stop pushing forward no matter what obstacles stood in their way. The age of human expansion had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.